You're walking down a street you know well when someone you've never seen before makes eye contact with you. What happens in your body in that fraction of a second? Something tightens. Your attention sharpens. You do a rapid, mostly unconscious assessment. Threat or not? Known or unknown? And within a moment, sometimes less, you've reached some kind of conclusion and your body adjusts accordingly. That flicker of response, that ancient micro-assessment, is not a quirk of modern urban anxiety. It is one of the oldest cognitive processes in the human brain. And understanding why it exists, and how it operated for early humans in a world where a stranger could mean almost anything, takes us to the heart of one of the most consequential questions in human prehistory. What actually happened when two groups of early humans, groups that didn't know each other, groups that may never have seen each other before, met for the first time? The range of possible answers spans the full spectrum of human experience: trade and alliance, intermarriage and cultural exchange, conflict and violence, absorption and assimilation, mutual avoidance, and sometimes the extinction of one group or the other. All of these happen. Understanding when and why each outcome occurred, and what early humans did to navigate this most dangerous and most consequential of social situations, is one of the great unresolved questions of human prehistory, and the answers are more nuanced and more surprising than most people expect. Let's get into it. First, let's establish the baseline. For most of the period we're talking about, the Paleolithic, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, early humans lived in small, mobile bands. The typical group size is estimated at somewhere between 20 and 50 individuals, though this varied significantly by environment and food availability. These groups were not isolated. They moved across landscapes, and their territories overlapped and changed over time. The idea that Paleolithic humans lived in permanent, isolated tribes that never encountered outsiders is a myth. Contact between groups was real, regular, and consequential. But the nature of that contact varied enormously depending on factors we can only partially reconstruct. How dense was the population in a given region? How abundant were resources? Was this a first contact or a renewed contact between groups that had history with each other? Were the groups of the same species or different? Were they close genetic relatives from recently diverged bands, or genuinely distant populations whose ancestors hadn't met in generations? Each of these variables shifted the odds of different outcomes dramatically. Let's start with what the archaeological evidence actually tells us. And here the picture is genuinely mixed in ways that should make us suspicious of simple narratives in either direction. On one side, there is unambiguous evidence of prehistoric violence between groups. The site of Crow Creek in South Dakota, dating to around 1325 CE, not prehistoric in the deep sense but ancient, contained the remains of approximately 500 people, showing clear evidence of massacre. Scalping, decapitation, perimortem bone trauma. The Crow Creek massacre is not an isolated anomaly. Sites showing evidence of collective violence appear across the prehistoric record on multiple continents. Researcher Lawrence Keeley at the University of Illinois Chicago published a comprehensive analysis in his book War Before Civilization of skeletal evidence for prehistoric violence, and his findings were striking. Rates of violent death in prehistoric skeletal samples, estimated from skull fractures, embedded projectile points, and perimortem bone trauma, were often significantly higher than violent death rates in even the most violent modern societies. This is not a comfortable finding, and it has been contested on methodological grounds, but it cannot simply be dismissed. On the other side, there is equally compelling evidence of peaceful exchange, intermarriage, and cultural transmission between groups. Researcher Johannes Krauss and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology have documented extensive genetic mixing between ancient human populations, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, Denisovans and modern humans, and between different populations of early modern humans that can only be explained by sustained contact and reproduction between groups that were, at minimum, not in constant violent conflict. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. We carry the DNA of groups that our ancestors met, interacted with, and reproduced with. violence, and exchange coexisted in the long record of human intergroup contact. Neither tells the whole story. So what determined which outcome occurred? This is where the anthropological and archaeological evidence becomes genuinely fascinating. Researcher Christopher Boehm at the University of Southern California, who has spent decades studying the social structures of hunter-gatherer groups, has argued that prehistoric intergroup encounters were governed by a sophisticated set of social protocols that evolved specifically to manage the danger of first contact. These protocols, documented across traditional cultures worldwide with remarkable consistency, share several core features. The first is distance management. Groups approaching each other's territory did not simply walk into contact. They signaled their approach from a distance, giving the other group time to prepare, assess, and choose their response. The specific signals varied: calls, fires, specific movements, but the function was consistent. Surprise was dangerous. Forewarning was safer for everyone. The second is the use of intermediaries. In many traditional cultures, contact between groups with uncertain relationships was managed through specific individuals who had established relationships across group boundaries. A person with kin in both groups, or a person specifically designated as a go-between, could carry messages, negotiate terms, and establish the initial framework for contact before the groups met directly. This reduced the risk that a misunderstanding in the initial moments of contact would escalate into violence. The third is ritualized behavior. When groups did meet, the initial interactions were often highly formalized. Specific gestures of non-aggression, setting down weapons, showing empty hands, specific postures or vocalizations, communicated peaceful intent before any verbal exchange was possible. These rituals served the same function across cultures: to solve the fundamental problem of first contact, which is that both groups are simultaneously signaling and assessing, and that a false read of the other's signals could have fatal consequences. There's a concept in game theory and evolutionary biology that helps explain why these protocols developed: the problem of coordination under mutual uncertainty. When two parties meet under uncertainty, each not knowing whether the other intends cooperation or conflict, the risk of mutual defection is high. If I assume you will attack and therefore attack first, and you assume I will attack and therefore attack first, we end up in a conflict that neither party may have initially intended. This is the fundamental danger of first contact, and it is not irrational. It is the product of a logical calculation under uncertainty. The protocols that evolved for managing first contact were essentially mechanisms for reducing this uncertainty. They created structured situations in which both parties could signal peaceful intent in ways that were costly enough to be credible. Laying down weapons, making yourself deliberately vulnerable, engaging in specific exchanges, these acts created mutual vulnerability that shifted the equilibrium away from mutual defection. Researcher Michael Alvard at Texas A&M University has studied the specific conditions under which intergroup cooperation and exchange emerged in prehistoric contexts, and his work consistently identifies the same key variable: the availability of goods or information that neither group could efficiently produce alone. When two groups had complementary resources, when one group had access to high-quality stone for tools, and the other had access to coastal shellfish, for example, the incentive for peaceful exchange overcame the danger of contact. Trade created mutual dependency, and mutual dependency created peace. But trade alone doesn't explain the full range of peaceful outcomes, because early humans also intermarried across group boundaries, and intermarriage, the exchange of people as well as goods, is a far deeper form of intergroup relationship than trade. Researcher Kim Hill at Arizona State University has documented extensive patterns of intermarriage between bands in traditional hunter-gatherer societies worldwide. In most of the groups he studied, a significant proportion of adults had been born in a different band than the one they currently lived with. This movement of people between groups, primarily women in patrilical societies, primarily men in matrilical ones, but often both, served multiple functions simultaneously. It created kinship ties between groups that made future contact less dangerous and future cooperation more likely. It diversified the genetic pool in ways that reduced inbreeding risk. It transmitted knowledge about resources, about routes, about plant medicine, about social practices across group boundaries. And it created individuals in every group who had personal, emotional ties to members of other groups, people who were therefore motivated to prevent conflict and maintain the connections that served everyone's interests. The person with a sibling in the neighboring group is a peace asset. They are personally invested in a non-violent relationship. They are a source of intelligence about the other group's composition, needs, and intentions. And in a crisis, they are the one who can walk into dangerous territory because they are recognized. What about encounters with genuinely unfamiliar groups? Groups for whom none of these relationship structures existed? Groups that were strangers in a deep sense? Here the evidence suggests that early humans had two primary strategies: avoidance and cautious approach. Avoidance is the default strategy in many traditional cultures when encountering unfamiliar groups. When the other group's intentions are genuinely unknown and the risks of contact are high, the safest option is simply to not make contact. This doesn't require hostility. It requires only a preference for known risk over unknown risk. Maintaining distance from strangers until more information is available is a rational response to genuine uncertainty, and it appears to have been common. Cautious approach, when it happened, typically involved the protocols described earlier: advanced signaling, intermediaries when possible, ritualized non-aggression behaviors, and initial exchanges designed to test the water before committing to full contact. Small gifts, sharing food, specific ritualized exchanges that had low cost for both parties but high symbolic value in establishing peaceful intent. Researcher Polly Wiesner at the University of Utah has documented how the HXRO gift exchange network among the Jew Hansi people of the Kalahari functions as a peace infrastructure. The network of exchange partnerships that spans multiple bands, where specific individuals in different groups maintain ongoing relationships of gift exchange, creates a distributed system of intergroup connection that makes violence between any two groups costly for the many pairs of exchange partners across those groups. You don't attack the group that contains your exchange partners. And then there were the encounters that went wrong, the ones where the protocols failed, where misreading occurred, where resources were too scarce to permit cooperation, or where accumulated grievances between groups reached a tipping point. The evidence for prehistoric violence is real, but what does it tell us specifically about encounters between strangers? Here the picture is complicated by the fact that violence between groups who know each other, raiding, revenge, competition over specific resources, may be more common than violence between genuinely unfamiliar strangers. The Crow Creek Massacre was almost certainly carried out by groups that knew each other and had history with each other. The violence was the product of sustained competition, not of first contact with the unknown. This distinction matters, because it suggests that the real danger in early human intergroup relations was not the stranger, the genuinely unfamiliar other, but the familiar enemy. The group that you knew, that you had competed with, that had violated agreements or taken resources or committed acts that demanded response. These relationships, with their specific histories and specific grievances, were probably the primary context for prehistoric intergroup violence. The stranger, the genuinely unknown other, was more likely to trigger the cautious approach protocols than immediate violence. Genuine uncertainty tends to produce caution. It is certainty about the other's hostile intentions or the specific grievances of ongoing competition that tends to produce violence. There's one final dimension of this story that I find genuinely moving: the genetic record of early human encounters. When you look at the DNA of living human populations, you find extensive evidence of ancient mixing, of encounters between populations that interbred and exchanged genes across what must have been significant barriers of distance and difference. The Neanderthal DNA that most people of non-African descent carry, typically 1 to 4% of the genome, is evidence of encounters that resulted not just in trade or alliance but in children who survived and reproduced and whose descendants eventually became us. These encounters between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals between early modern humans and Denisovans, between different populations of modern humans across the Pleistocene world, were not encounters between equals in many cases. They occurred in contexts of expansion and competition. Some of them may have been violent, and yet they also resulted in reproduction, in connection, in the literal mixing of two populations into something new. We are the result of every encounter that worked out, every trade partnership that created mutual benefit, every marriage alliance that tied groups together, every cautious first contact that led, gradually, to something like trust, and every child born across a group boundary who carried, in their DNA, the evidence of a connection that was made. The next time you feel that ancient microassessment, that fraction of a second evaluation of an approaching stranger, you are running a program that evolved in exactly this context. The program that kept early humans alive long enough to make contact, to trade, to intermarry, to merge. The program that over hundreds of thousands of years produced the entire range of human cultural diversity that exists today. That assessment is not paranoia. It is the beginning of every human relationship that has ever been formed across difference. If this one made you think about the stranger you passed today, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one. There's something worth adding about the role of language, or more precisely, the absence of shared language in early human encounters with strangers. When two groups met who did not share a language, the entire first contact had to be conducted through body language, gesture, tone of voice, and action. And this is actually not as limiting as it sounds, because body language and gesture are remarkably universal in ways that spoken language is not. The facial expressions of fear, friendliness, aggression, and surprise are recognized across all human cultures. The gesture of open hands showing no weapon is recognized everywhere. The offering of food, presenting something edible, and then eating it yourself to demonstrate it's not poisonous, communicates hospitality across any language barrier. Researcher Michael Tomasello at Duke University has documented how human beings are extraordinarily capable of communicating across language barriers through shared attention, pointing, and iconic gesture. Young children who share no language can coordinate joint activities with remarkable effectiveness. This capacity, the ability to communicate intent and meaning without shared words, was almost certainly essential for managing early human encounters with strangers. The meeting of two groups who shared no language was probably negotiated primarily through exactly these nonverbal channels, supplemented by whatever contextual signals each group could provide about their intentions. And the fact that such encounters often led to sustained exchange and eventual intermarriage suggests that these nonverbal channels were adequate for the task, at least when both parties were genuinely interested in making contact work. There is also the question of what early humans thought about strangers in a conceptual sense. How did they understand the other, the person from outside the group? We can't know this directly. We have no access to the thoughts of Paleolithic people. But we have indirect evidence from the structure of traditional cultures worldwide, from the patterns of behavior documented ethnographically, and from the evolutionary logic of the situation. One consistent finding across traditional cultures is that the boundary between us and them, between in-group and out-group, was rarely as sharp or permanent as we might imagine. Groups were not fixed entities. They fissioned when they got too large, with subgroups splitting off to form new bands. They merged when populations declined, with remnant groups joining larger ones. Individuals moved between groups through marriage, adoption, and voluntary affiliation. The stranger of one generation could be the kin of the next. This fluidity suggests that early humans had a more dynamic understanding of group membership than the fixed tribe model implies. The stranger was potentially a future member of the group, a potential trade partner, a potential in-law. The question was not simply friend or foe, but what kind of relationship is possible here, and what would we need to do to create it? Anthropologist Marshall Solins argued that in many traditional cultures, strangers occupied a conceptually liminal position, neither friend nor enemy, but something that could become either. The rituals of first contact were, among other things, rituals for transforming a stranger from liminal to known, for placing the unknown person in a social category that specified how they should be treated and what could be expected from them. This transformation, from stranger to trading partner, from stranger to in-law, from stranger to ally, is perhaps the most fundamentally human social act. It is the act of extending the circle of recognized persons outward, of deciding that this unknown other is worth the risk of connection. We still do it. Every time we meet someone new, we are engaging in a version of this ancient act, the assessment, the signaling, the cautious approach, the first exchange, and, sometimes, the beginning of something that neither party could have predicted when they first laid eyes on each other. That process, that ancient and still running process of turning strangers into something else, is not just a social skill. It is the mechanism by which every human relationship, every alliance, every friendship, every family across difference has ever been built. And it started, like most human things, in a landscape without maps, between people who didn't know each other's names, trying to figure out if this moment was going to be the beginning of something or the end of it.